Hello, welcome. It's Frances here. Thank you for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I bid thee welcome. There's a subscribe button and a bell below if you want to be notified as to when I upload more content, which I do on a rather ad hoc basis and on a whole range of subjects. This is probably a little video on one of my favorite subjects at the moment, in relation to shadow work, exploring the shadow aspects of our personality and the various tools that we can actually put into our toolbox so we can do this in probably a safe environment outside of a professional counselling or psychologist session. And I'm just saying this because, first disclaimer, I'm not a professional psychologist or psychiatrist or counsellor. I do hold certificates in metaphysical sciences, I guess you could call that. Also neuro-linguistic programming, which is sort of follows in this area as well. But I do stress that if you're wanting to do any sort of shadow work, and should things begin to be dislodged or come up to the surface that may have resulted from past life trauma, we all process these differently, and some of them can be quite, I won't say severe, but they can be extremely traumatic, which is why our subconscious mind has actually placed memories of these into the shadow. And this is one of the, I suppose, activities or purposes of our shadow, of our subconscious mind, to act as sort of a guard dog, I suppose, as to what we can consciously process. Not saying that these don't emerge as we get older, especially if they are linked to traumatic experiences as a child. And sometimes it's our emotional attachment, which is what neuro-linguistic programming through the technique of timeline therapy focuses on, removing our emotional attachment to a past event, because you can't expunge what's happened in the past, no matter how much we would like to try, but we can certainly lessen our emotional attachment. And that's one of the underlying aspects that a lot of techniques, beliefs, use whatever word fits best to you, associates with the actual physical event itself. It's our emotional attachment to it. So according to NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, when we remove our emotional attachment, we can then look at the event a little bit more objectively. And I suppose in any situation where we find ourselves deeply emotionally invested, when we are able to step back from it, we are able to see things a little bit more clearly. And that's still through our own perspective, our own lens, so to speak. But we can then, from an element of clarity, decide on what is the best process forward for us. We're not talking about justice or anything like that. We're just looking at ourselves as an energetic being, how we can move forward and what's best for us. So there's a whole range of tools, techniques, advice out there as to working with shadow self, shadow work. There's a whole, it's almost like a can of worms, Pandora's box, this whole subject. And everybody's got different approaches. And I think that's important to sort of just keep in the back of your mind. So what works for one person may not necessarily work for another person. And also from my own personal experience, the planes going overhead, this sort of work may take a long time to get the results that we so far desire. That's if we have any sort of preconceived ideas as to what we're wanting to achieve in the first place. A lot of this work, I suppose like any sort of self-work, you often don't see results immediately, but you do notice things over time. And often when someone else points something out to you, they might say you might have changed, or one day you might realize that you no longer get emotionally involved or react in a certain way to certain experiences. And this is when you know that you've actually, or the work that you've actually done is taking effect. So, like, some people use numerology, some people use astrology. I've just finished up a course on looking at Chiron, which is our wounded healer in our charts, astrological charts, which has been very interesting. And still, I'm the sort of person that will take a while to sort of process all this, because I'm not an astrologer, and getting in touch with or understanding some of these terms and working out placements has been a little bit of an interesting dive into an aspect of my life. But if you are familiar with some of my work, you will know that last March, I put out Encountering the Dark Goddess, A Journey into the Shadow Realms, where through the tool of mythology, looking at specific goddesses that are more associated with sort of shadowy aspects of our personality. And again, this is open to interpretation. Everybody's different to what that means. I like to use the myth. So it's more than Carl Jung, who is a psychoanalyst who, though I'm not a psychoanalyst or psychotherapist, I am very interested in his work. He used the concept of an archetype. And I sort of used myth in that way, looking at the stories and the characters in the stories to see what resonates with me and what message the story is actually speaking to me about. It's the same if you use it with folk tales, any sort of myth story in that way. Culture, as it is, us humans, we've been making up stories. Are we actually making them up? We have been compiling stories to talk about how things, or explain how things evolved, the meaning of life, to use as examples of morals, of guidelines, how to act, the dangers that are in our natural world, etc. I form the opinion that there's always an element of truth in these stories, in these myths, in these folklores, in these tales. And there's this element of truth that I believe in, because that to me indicates why we've actually created the story in the first place. There's got to be some underlying backstory to the story of, say, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of ancient Egypt, who was largely associated with deserts, ruled from Memphis. And one of the better known stories of her, she became the sun god Ra's antagonist against humans. And in that, she became associated with emotions such as anger and rage, because she got into a little bit of a bloodlust fury, punishing the non-compliant humans for not worshipping the sun god Ra. And to me, looking at that story, she's tapping into or showing us emotions that in our modern culture we suppress. We have been told right from the get-go, programmed, that our anger and our rage is not acceptable. We're not told how to manage it. We're basically told not to be angry. So a lot of us, especially women, suppress that anger. And as we get older, it can actually, or the suppressed anger and rage, not speaking our truth, not wanting to upset other people, or being told we have to fit to this nice little compliant box, can actually have a detrimental effect on us physically, mentally, emotionally, even spiritually. And then something happens later in life, and this could be tying back to the course that I've recently completed about Chiron. We get to a stage in our life, and it might be due to the wounded healer reaching its return in our natal chart, that we no longer care, that we explode, so to speak. So the better way to deal with anger is actually quite a natural emotion. Yes, it might not be suitable in our society, or how we express it is probably the more appropriate way. How we express it in our society, because we don't, and we haven't been given the proper tools to manage it. But it's energy. It's this real strong force of energy. In the past, our ancestors may have used that sort of fight or flight energy to go hunting, to protect themselves from wild animals, from danger. We live in a rather subdued society with respect to that, though it's a bit ironic because at the moment there is a war going on, but the energy is a little bit different, so to speak. And if we're not engaged in something physical, so we can utilize this anger and this rage, we need to learn how to channel it better as opposed to absorbing it. And I think it's the Chinese who actually say that if you find that you have liver problems, that's where our unprocessed anger actually lies in our body, is that major organ, which is our liver. So to me, working with the dark goddess myths, in particular Sekhmet in this instance, could be Pele from the Hawaiian, who's the volcano goddess. We're tapping into this raw energy that some people may deem as anger as negative, but it's still potent strength, power, energy. And through analyzing the myths, we can gain ideas as to how we can utilize and transform that so-called negative emotion into something a little bit more congruent and a better place for our society, but also for our own selves. So we can tap into that power that's behind the anger. First, maybe identify why or what has actually caused our anger to come up to the surface. And it may be something initially, like someone cut us off in traffic. But if we spend some time and observe ourselves, and a lot of this is self-observation, through meditation, even timeline therapy could also help to find out what is what they call the underlying root cause of the anger. When did it start to first manifest in a way that wasn't deemed suitable, or that we've been told is not suitable? It could actually stem back to our childhood, where, say, for example, maybe we were a firstborn child, and then the second sibling came along, and so our sort of ranking in the family changed, our whole family dynamics. And as a young child, you're not usually able to process a lot of these societal structures. And say the younger sibling breaks something that we like, so we get angry and upset and lash out. And then our parents' response to us was to punish us as opposed to the sibling who broke our toy, for example. And so we end up having this sort of unfairness, this guilt, this association of anger and pain, not being worthy enough, that our position or our favourite toy has been ruined and we're being punished, and we feel it's being undue or it's inappropriate, and we're not getting sort of the result that we wanted. So working through, say, a goddess with Sekhmet, we may be able to actually go back in time to find that first cause issue instance in our life, and then what, say, linguistic programming we do, we actually then lose or lessen our emotional attachment to that. We can then transform or transmutate that anger, that energy that's surrounded with that anger, into something a little bit more constructive in our life. If we're finding that in other areas of our lives we may be procrastinating, there's something blocking us, maybe we can use that energy from our anger and transform it into the energy to push us forward, to push us through some blockage for whatever reason. And one of the techniques that I use, as I said, is using the story of Sekhmet and actually using her. You can use her as an archetype, or if you believe in deity, use her as an actual goddess to help you move through that power shift and that power transformation. So what we're actually doing is that we're not removing anything from the past, because we can't, except for our emotional attachment. And then we're actually integrating, and I think that's one of the most important things when it comes to shadow self. We're actually integrating the aspect of ourselves that we have been ignoring, suppressing, rejecting. We are accepting the fact that, okay, we are going to be angry. It's a natural emotion occurrence. That's okay. We can sit with that emotion, see where in our body that anger is rising up from. Go into that aspect, breathe through it, a whole range of different techniques, and then utilize that energy into something that's a little bit more constructive in our life where we are now. Yes, it's easy to talk about it in such an example. It's harder at times to actually do the work. And this is another thing when it comes to shadow work. It's so easy to read, to watch blogs, do courses, and do things on a surface level. To get the benefit out of any sort of work in this area, you need to be honest with yourself. You need to dive deep. You need to expose yourself, be vulnerable, and true to the emotions that are surfacing. Otherwise, it sort of defeats the whole purpose. I strongly recommend getting a notebook, whether it's just a little normal notebook like this. You can get a fancy journal. You can scribble notes and points like I do all the time. You can do dot points, you could do doodles, you could cut out symbols or images from magazines, newspaper headings, download memes from the net, anything like that that express where you are at. And this is the second stage to shadow work, is a lot of it's done through reflection. Seeing where you are at when you started the journey, having an idea of where the direction you want to head into, then later seeing where you are when you've reached the end of the journey, if you ever do. And this is another thing about shadow work that sort of amuses me, going by some people on social media, is that they give the impression that, oh, I've done my shadow work. And it's just like, really? How wonderful. Because I like to quote, I know he's a poet, I don't know if he's actually an analyst himself, a gentleman by the name of Robert Bly, who, and I will be paraphrasing, basically said that when it comes to shadow work, we all drag this bag around behind us. And for the first 20 years of our life, we are constantly shoving things into this bag that we don't like, we want to repress, suppress, reject, that we feel guilty about, etc. All our shadow stuff we put into this bag. First 20 years of our life. And there's a lot of stuff, because we are learning. Then from 20 onwards, I personally would say probably about 25 onwards, we begin to start pulling these things out of our bag again. And we continue doing that for the rest of our lives. Because once we put things in our bag, it doesn't go away. It's rather like sweeping dust under the carpet. And if your dust is anything like my dust bunnies, they take on a life of their own. And the shadow does do that. It can actually take on a life of its own, and it can actually make itself known to you, especially middle age onwards, and often at the most inconvenient moments, where we start questioning where we are at, what direction that we're heading, what have we done. And this is around the time when we often have what people call midlife crises. We realise that the job that we've been doing or the career that we're in isn't really us. We're actually living someone else's dream. And we often, if we're in touch with ourselves, change our path in life, change the direction. And knowing that that is okay, I think is a very important thing and part of this integration into the self. So this is just a few thoughts. I hope that has been of interest, something to think about. If you have any comments, would like to share anything, please leave comments below. And have a wonderful day. Thanks.